But thank you everyone for joining today. So we'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. We respectfully acknowledge that the lands we are situated on are traditional territories and treaty lands, in particular those of the Mississaugas of the Credit, as well as the Anishinaabe of the Williams Treaty First Nations, the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and are now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. As stewards of land and water resources within the Greater Toronto Region, the Toronto Region Conservation Authority appreciates and respects the history and diversity of the land and is grateful to have the opportunity to work and meet in this territory. And this land has been a site of human activity for 15,000 years, and we'd like to take a moment to not just recite a scripted acknowledgement, but also reflect on how we can contribute to reconciliation. And part of that is in education, and we'll be touching on a few related points today, but we also encourage you to learn more about the Indigenous groups mentioned here. You'll receive a list of additional resources at the end of today's webinar, which will be a great place to start. And before we move on to the body of the webinar, we wanted to give you a quick overview of who we are as the Youth Council. So the Youth Council aims to build healthy communities through improved connection to green space and nature, and to inspire healthy communities and empowered and engaged youth. The council is made up of over 100 general members and 9 executive members. As executive members, we're responsible for organizing events or finding opportunities for general members to participate in that promote and benefit environmental well-being in the GTA. This has been a challenge this year, but we hope that you'll enjoy this webinar and the online content to come. So I forgot to introduce myself. You can see my name. I'm Wei. I'm a PhD student at the University of Toronto Scarborough studying environmental sciences. And the first part of the webinar will be delivered by my partner, Maya, who's going to introduce herself shortly.
Thanks, Wei. My name is Maya. I am also a member of the TRCA Youth Executive Council and an undergrad student studying environmental studies at York University. Thank you for joining us this evening for our webinar. We have a lot of information to cover, and we hope that you learned something new tonight. So I'm going to start off our webinar by going over some of the history of environmentalism. This is by no means the full history, and I highly encourage everyone to look into this topic further. So starting with European colonization of North America, the doctrine of discovery was a framework that granted permission to European Christian explorers to claim any territory that was terra nullius, meaning nobody's lands. This meant that the land was not inhabited by Christians and therefore was used as justification for colonization when Europeans, quote unquote, discovered North America and claimed sovereignty over lands that were already occupied by Indigenous peoples. Settlers claimed that Canada was a vast wilderness, as illustrated here in this group of 7 painting, with very few Indigenous peoples. Now, this claim was obviously false. It is estimated that at around the time Columbus arrived in 1492, there were over 100 million Indigenous peoples occupying the Americas and who have been living here since time immemorial. The method of claiming lands was violent and manipulative, and it violated many treaties and agreements that were agreed upon between Indigenous nations and European settlers. Several colonial tactics, such as the Indian Act, were used in further oppressing Indigenous peoples, a main tactic being the banning of traditional cultural practices, such as hunting and holding ceremony. The forced displacement and abuse and genocide of Indigenous peoples are all forms of colonial violence that continue to leave traumas on communities. Colonialism also brought slavery and the exploitation of Black people for their free labor. This is obviously an enormous topic to unpack, and we will continue that discussion in a few minutes with our first speaker. Please keep in mind throughout this webinar that the legacies of colonialism and several of these practices are heavily entrenched in our social, environmental, and political systems, and are detriment to environmental justice, social justice, and the well-being of community members. It is in the best interest for all of us to commit to resisting these colonial theories and to examine and unpack them in our daily lives and work. Now, early environmentalists in North America, this movement was started by wealthy white conservationists who had the means to create national parks, forests, game refuges, and a zoo such as this Bronx Zoo shown here. Two famous examples of conservationists were Madison Grant and Theodore Roosevelt. However, they were not only champions of the early conservation movement, but they also were supporters of racism. Grant is famous for writing a book that warned the decline in the so-called Nordic peoples, and Roosevelt and other environmentalists at the time showed their support for these racist ideals. Their conservation efforts sought to protect some iconic species used for game, and Grant wrote about noble animals whose needs for protection resembled the plight of the Nordics. Their work further influenced policies and laws, such as the American Immigration Act of 1924, which restricted immigration of people from mostly non-European countries. Therefore, conservation of nature was, in effect, to serve the wealthy white aristocracy, and it was an intentional way of serving white elites only. This legacy of making environmentalism a field for white and middle/upper class people has continued. Still to this day, those in leadership positions are mostly white and middle class, and has resulted in practices that neglect and harm racialized and working class communities. The impacts of colonialism and systemic racism can also be seen in the geographic distribution of racialized communities. These communities were often segregated to reservations or undesirable land, such as lands near industrial areas. Examples of this in Canada include Africville, the Oka crisis, Grassy Narrows, Wet'suwet'en, and Kashechewan water crisis. I only have time to detail one of these examples today, but I highly recommend everyone to look into these hidden histories. Africville is a part of Canadian history that is often left out from our mainstream history lessons. This is despite its long history. Africville was around for 150 years, which when you think about it is as old as this country, right? As old as Canada itself, and still many of us are unaware of it. Africville was established in 1848 and was a community of predominantly Black residents, many of whom arrived in Nova Scotia after the American Revolution in the late 1700s and early 1800s. It's important to note that Black people have been living in Nova Scotia since before the founding of Halifax in 1749, which is before many of the white settlers also. Black people were promised land and freedom. However, when they arrived, they faced prejudice and racism and were pushed to the margins and were forced to create their own closely knit communities where they lived self-sufficiently and were able to thrive. So why Africville and environmental racism? Well, because the city of Halifax refused to provide basic amenities like sewage, waste disposal, and access to clean water, despite residents paying taxes just like everyone else. And to make it worse, the city also built an infectious diseases hospital, a dump, and a prison right next to the community. So if you can imagine, this community, which again was as old as Canada itself, was neglected and denied proper care and basic human rights. The city hardly consulted with Africville residents, and in the 1960s, the government forced residents to move to the city by demolishing everything: their homes, the church, local businesses, and Africville residents received very little, if any, compensation, and this displacement and dispersal of the community left huge unrepairable social and economic consequences. Formal residents and descendants had to push for a settlement and recognition of this history, and it was only then that the city of Halifax finally formally apologized in 2010, over 40 years later. So while we're on this topic, I would like to introduce our first speaker, Yaz. Yaz is a community organizer and Master of Education candidate at the University of Toronto, where her studies focus on environmental racism and how racialized youth face barriers in outdoor education. She has worked with Climate Justice TO and has extensive experience in community organizing, facilitation, and program development in higher education and the social sector. Welcome, Yaz.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for this, and thank you for your really important reflections that you just shared. So yeah, I'm really glad to be here. And yeah, similarly to what you just said, my name is Yaz. And I live here as an uninvited settler and a guest in Toronto on the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Wendat Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. So yeah, excited to be here. Thank you.
Awesome, thank you. So your specialty is studying environmental racism. So I'd like to pose this question to you. How do the histories of colonialism and slavery translate into the environmental racism that affects largely Black and Indigenous communities in North America today? And I was also hoping you could speak to the hidden history of slavery in Canada, because we often don't know about Canadian slavery, right? We tend to think of it as an American issue. So I'm thinking that many of us are unaware of the full history.
Totally. No, thank you for that question. So I think to begin to answer, we have to sit deeply with the paradox that these histories are so pervasive in our structures and systems and policies that dominate our society, yet are so erased from our collective popular consciousness. In the context of Turtle Island, like you mentioned, oftentimes we in so-called Canada like to use the comparison of the violent colonialism and systemic racism that the States had as a way to justify we're like not as bad as them attitude that is extremely dangerous and contributes to the erasure and the disposability of Black people and Indigenous peoples and racialized peoples here in so-called Canada experiencing that systemic racism. So yeah, Canada had slavery, and it transpired between the 1600s and was not abolished here until August 1st, 1834. And in what is now so-called Quebec, there were over 4,200 enslaved peoples during that time, all of whom were Indigenous or Black. And many people don't know that the first enslaved peoples here in what is now called now Quebec, but then called New France, were Indigenous peoples. And with slavery, the Indian Act, the 60s scoop, and more of the systemic harm, we are still to this day seeing the intergenerational traumas and violences of these systems and structures, like you mentioned. So when it comes to environmental racism, it's often quite covert, and many folks, like you said, it's hidden, right? And they don't recognize it as a systemic issue. But when we think of the social and structural determinants of health that allow for people to have a decent livelihood, we are consistently seeing how it's disproportionately affecting and have toxins in the communities that are often lower income, highly racialized, Black and Indigenous, and made up of newcomers, and specifically on Indigenous nations, territories, and reserves. And why is it that the Chemical Valley, the most toxic geographical location in so-called Canada, is in the heart of Aamjiwnaang First Nation? Why is it that 90% of Grassy Narrows residents suffer from mercury poisoning, a poisoning that is a result of the Dryden chemicals dumping mercury into the English Wagigun River system in between 1962 to 1970, and yet has still not been cleaned up or treated? Why is it that the new LRT line that's being constructed in Toronto is in the heart of the historic part of Eglinton West, known as Little Jamaica, where people's health and livelihoods now are being dramatically affected by this construction that's been going on since 2011, that is continuing to happen, and is over a decade-long project at this point. And it keeps getting extended and has pushed out the Black Jamaican residents there. None of these are by chance. And I just wanted to highlight that because I think a lot of times when you just see these instances, you don't really see the interconnections, but we are seeing that, and we know that this is due to policy and due to the structures in place. And we just saw the raid of 6 nations, right? And that's extremely violent, and that is environmental racism. I think we need to think about how the settler colonial nation state came to be. And when you reflect on it, you realize everything about the founding of this colonial state is in fact an act of environmental racism. This is stolen land. And a good example of that is something I learned this past February at an action, is that Ottawa is built on unceded Algonquin territory, which means that Canada's capital city is occupying illegally on unceded land, right? And that's no mistake. And I want that to be really clear. Like, this is an ongoing legacy of deep-rooted systemic colonialism. And what we're seeing is a result of an ongoing indoctrination of settlers, actively and passively believing that we have the right to land and the right to toxify and break communities as long as they aren't wealthy middle to upper class white communities. So yeah, the lack of popular knowledge and apathy around the ongoing ways in which colonialism and racism show up in and of itself is a testament to the fact that they are both so systemically present in our society. So colonialism is alive, racism is alive, and capitalism is alive. But right now we are seeing some really important and powerful wins, and we will win. However, we need to keep this movement sustainable and accountable and grounded. So yeah, thanks. That's
amazing. Thank you so much. And also on that note, if you could please describe the ways in which people of color, Black and Indigenous, and also youth are actively fighting back and resisting environmental racism. That'd be amazing.
Totally. Yeah, for sure. So when I think about that, there are so many ways in which like resistance is happening. I think there's that popular quote that gets thrown around that our existence is resistance. And sometimes it feels silly, but I really want to emphasize how true that is. And why it's so true is that we know that this white supremacist, colonial, capitalist society, Black and Indigenous peoples are seen as a threat and we're seen as disposable. Yet we're still here and we're still existing and we're still resisting through the upkeep of traditional, ancestral, cultural practices and languages and knowledges. And what I want to emphasize is that that is no small act. Sometimes I think people don't recognize that these practices of traditions and ancestral knowledge, it's so deeply important because for so long it was illegal for Indigenous peoples to use their languages and it was illegal for Black peoples to live in non-segregated communities. And yet we're here and we're not being silent. And in all of these cases of environmental racism, we can see the interconnection of these movements. So I'm seeing so much resistance through the organizing right now. And as mentioned, we're seeing some incredible wins. But again, I think white settlers and non-Black and non-Indigenous people need to understand that you can't get comfortable just because it's no longer in the news or circulating, because that complacency makes you complicit to the environmental racism we're seeing. So these movements and organizations need to consistently center Black and Indigenous peoples, and just to shout out a few that are doing really amazing work is the Encampment Support Network here in Toronto that's fighting to keep folks able to live in their tent cities in housing, right? Then we have like Free Grassy Narrows, which is fighting to have the mercury cleaned out of their systems. And we have Reclaim Eglinton West, which is fighting to keep Black residents in Little Jamaica in a thriving community. We have Climate Justice Toronto, who is doing a lot of different works, but is really have been highlighting the interconnections of all of these movements. We have Get In Den Checkpoint and Wet'suwet'en in Solidarity, and Not Another Black Life, Black Lives Matter Toronto. I think often like we don't see, I guess, I think there's a separation often, like when people are doing racial justice and environmental justice, but what I think we're seeing in this moment and is being illuminated is how much they are interconnected. And so yeah, I just really encourage people to kind of find their groups in their area, and if there aren't any, to kind of start doing that work themselves and do that unlearning. So yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, you bring up a really great point. It's not just a one-time fight, right? It's ongoing, and we have to do that work of constantly educating ourselves and finding resources for ourselves to bring this kind of knowledge into our work and into our everyday lives. And like you mentioned, racial justice and environmental justice is gender, women justice, you know, like it's all interconnected. So thank you very much for that, Yaz.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Sorry, I'm always bad at technology. I'm trying to figure out how to log off the, oh, figured it out. Sorry, thanks.
Okay, so moving on to access. Some studies in North America have shown that factors such as income, higher education, and race are strong factors that are associated with access to green space. Especially in dense urban areas, racialized residents are less likely to have access to mixed and wooded vegetation, while residents with higher income and higher levels of education have more access to green space. This finding is pretty troubling, considering that access to greenery improves physical and mental well-being, and as well helps mitigate the intense heat effects of urban areas. So our next speaker will be speaking to this topic shortly, and I'll pass it back to Wei.
Great, thanks, Maya. So there are a lot of dimensions to access and inclusion. And before we do a deeper dive, we thought we'd go over a few examples of barriers to inclusion in outdoor spaces to get us all in the same kind of headspace. So first, there are a lot of well-meaning policies and regulations that can have different impacts on disadvantaged people. So for example, having few cross connections on a multi-use trail might seem beneficial for cyclists, but it's often perceived as dangerous to solo pedestrians who prefer to have quick exit options. Secondly, for a long time, environmental and outdoor marketing has been targeted towards white audiences, and only in recent years has it been that marketing campaigns have expanded their scopes. Lastly, infrastructure plays a significant role in accessibility in a way that privileged people often don't understand. So you may be familiar with this news story from a couple of years ago. When the park reopened at Ontario Place, the signs with Braille were A, below waist level, and B, printed on flat board, so they were effectively useless. So to talk a little bit more about the ways that barriers to access to green space can be manifest, I'd like to invite our next speaker, Holly. Holly's a coordinator with the TRCA Sustainable Neighborhood Action Program, or SNAP, and has been working in the Jane and Finch community as part of the Black Creek SNAP since 2013. A lot of her work has been in community capacity building and in the creation and improvement of access to green space. Holly, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you. Very happy to be here. It's an honor, really. And you girls have been doing such a great job, and thank you to the other speakers. It's been amazing. I've already learned a lot already, so I'm glad to be able to contribute.
Amazing. I know you have a lot of things to contribute, so let's dive right into it. I have a couple of multi-part questions for you. But to start us off, what does access to nature really mean, and what are some barriers that marginalized youth may face when they're trying to access nature? Like, what are some ways that environmentalists unintentionally reinforce inaccessibility when they're working with marginalized youth?
Yeah, absolutely. So when you're talking about access to nature, you're talking about the opportunity to be exposed to and really interact with nature in the naturalized environment. So access to really immersive experiences, like you're talking about those canoe trips, those overnight camping trips. If you have marginalized youth, they would really face a lot of barriers, maybe coming from families where the parents are working 2 or 3 jobs, precarious jobs. They don't get vacation time. Those things are all barriers. The cost of all the gear that's required for those immersive experiences, where to even store it if you're living in a condo or apartment. So there's barriers kind of every step of the way for those really immersive experiences. But even the things that are free, like, if you want to just access nature, like taking a walk through a city park or a nice tree-lined street, if you're from certain areas in the city of Toronto, we're still seeing those neighborhood improvement areas, specifically talking about Jane Finch, where they lack green space. We're still lacking parkland. We have some of the lowest parkland per capita in the city of Toronto. We have a poor urban forest, low canopy cover. So, really marginalized youth have less options of green space in their neighborhoods, and that's just a barrier in itself. Those spaces don't exist. But let's say that there is, good free green space in those neighborhoods. Like, we do have a lot of beautiful ravine systems throughout Toronto, but racialized, marginalized communities, these areas, like the ravine system particularly, could be stigmatized as being dangerous, right? People are warned not to go down there. They don't want to get jumped, they don't want to get hurt, and sometimes that's real, valid fear. There have been people that have been murdered in our ravine systems, but it could also just be like this, typical fear, like if someone might be jumping out of the bushes, like those poor bushes. the bushes get picked on, but even like police and community, like when they're doing their safety audits, they advise property owners to cut down those groves of trees or those shrubs for that exact reason, because they come with a perceived safety risk in those communities. So like with that stigma of natural areas, it could really prevent people from getting out and enjoying the limited green space that does exist in their neighborhoods. But when you want to talk about like unintentionally reinforcing like access or, you know, inequalities, you know, we talk about, can these youth even get to our conservation areas? Like, they're not exactly on the TTC route all the time, right? TRCA does try to bring, you know, watershed on wheels and stuff to other schools, but you know, it's the schools that have really good administration, really great teachers that are like consistent, or parent council that have access to those programs. And a lot of the times, like for example, Black Creek Pioneer Village, they provide, you know, free field trips for our local schools here in Jane and Finch, but the staff were saying that many of those schools don't take advantage of it, and they just couldn't figure out why. And, you know, I was sitting on the education working group for our local planning table at the time, and I heard that the parents were expressing concern that there is such a high turnover rate for school administration and staff in those neighborhoods. Like, they can't keep a principal, they can't keep a VP. And those are systemic educational issues in our neighborhoods that, you know, would even if there is a budget for a field trip, never mind being offered a free one, they're not able to take it because of the constant, you know, new staff turnover. So we got to bring some of those programmings to our community. Last year, they had a mobile museum go around to community events, and, you know, that is a step in the right direction. But oftentimes, like conservation staff or, you know, environmental staff, we have these stereotypes, you know, we just do. We have these stereotypes, these hesitations that youth from certain neighborhoods, because they have lack of access, they won't know how to interact with nature, and they'll be at a higher risk. And, you know, we need to challenge that thinking. Last year, when we brought a group of about 60 middle school students from the neighborhood to do a big ravine planting in Black Creek Ravine, there was a lot of hesitations from the teachers and from staff about, like, it would be risky for us to bring those kids. Like, why is it more risky to bring those kids than kids from another neighborhood? You know what I mean? Like, like if we need to make some adjustments, and we made adjustments. Like we brought in more vegetarian or halal options for our lunches and food. We brought in more staff for the day. But really, at the end of the day, like, our staff were saying that was some of the best, you know, best school planting that they've ever had. And I'll never forget, there was a young guy, and he was planting the trees, and he was just really enjoying it. And he was like, I'm outside in the fresh air, getting my exercise. And he's like, he asked our staff, like, how much did they pay you to do this? And they were like, oh, I guess, you know, must start at a little over $20 an hour. His eyes were like, got so wide. And he was like, what do you have to study? Like, where do I sign up, kind of thing, right? It's like, what do I have to study? And he's like, oh, I just went here to York for environmental science. And you could just see, like he was inspired at that moment. You know, he might pursue that, you know, in his future. So those assumptions that we have, those hesitations or stereotypes, we really need to challenge it. The assumptions that people have more exposure than they do, and like that shock response, like, you don't know how to, like, you've never been in a canoe, you know, like, we have to stop that, really, like, cut that criticism and shock. There was a guy that had grown up in Toronto, and he was saying that he had never visited the lake. Like, he had never been to Lake Ontario. And that can evoke shock and appall in some environmental conservationists, right? Like, how does that happen? What planet are they living on? And like, that response just does not help anybody. Cut the criticism, cut the shock value. Like, that's somebody's reality. That's what they're actually living. And instead, like, we need to just meet people where they're at, come alongside them, and enjoy those formative moments with them. Like that curiosity, that awe-inspiring wonder that comes with them interacting with nature. Like, enjoy that with them, encourage that in a really safe, non-judgmental way, right? And I myself have been guilty of this at times. We had a program where we were teaching people how to take care of fruit trees. We were bringing apartment tower residents who had received that training, and they were working on some backyard neighborhood homes, and the community was mobilizing. A social enterprise was emerging, and like, one African father, like, you gotta love him. His son and daughter had received the training, and I was trying to convince him to let his kids participate, like, go into the backyards. Like, this is a good way to keep up their practice of their skills. They can make a few bucks. And he was like, nope, my kids are not going there. And like I was really trying to convince him, and he's telling me like, no, someone's going to see my son in a backyard and they're going to think this kid doesn't belong there, that kid's not supposed to be there, and it could really bring some unnecessary trouble for his son. And it was a couple of years back, but it was very close to the time where, you know, Trayvon Martin was killed for, you know, being in the side of a neighborhood where someone thought he didn't belong, right? And so me, in my ignorance, I was still trying to convince him. I was like, no, don't worry, this is gonna be fine, it's gonna be a good experience for him. And he looked at me, he's like, Holly, this is what I have to think about to make sure I keep my son safe, that he keep him alive. This is the things I have to consider. And I was like, you're right. You're right.
Yeah.
And it's just that, like, in that instance, racism was the real barrier to prevent these Black youth from being able to get into the conservation and environmental movement. And we need better. We need to do better as individuals. We need to do better as society. We need to do better as an environmental movement to acknowledge that, like, that's what people have to consider. Like, is someone going to be like, you don't belong there? No, you're not involved in like some great environmental initiative where you're helping a senior in their backyard. No, you don't belong there. You're up to no good, and it could cause them to get in some real danger. So
Absolutely, that's something a lot of people don't consider, but it's also in the moments that someone in those neighborhoods considers environment, like the one kid on the tree planting who's like, how do you do this? That's like the best thing to hear as an environmental educator. It's so satisfying. And we are running a little bit short on time, but before we close off, can you give us an overview of the SNAP program? Like, how does SNAP and other programs like it help marginalized youth advance their careers in the environmental sector? And what does it take for those kind of programs to be successful?
Okay, I'm going to try to be really quick on this one. So SNAP is a sustainable neighborhood action program. It's really a solution for urban renewal, climate action, like right at the neighborhood scale. So we look at all, you know, land uses, try to find some good efficiencies and overlap opportunities to create these multi-objective, multi-sector partnership implementations of an action plan that is actually co-designed with the community. So community interests are front and center in our action plans. They're co-designed with the community. And it provides, you know, the community really what they're looking for. So something they can get behind, interested and excited about. It fosters really good community cohesion and community pride in the community, and it provides, you know, a way for them to identify how the environmental issues and the community issues like are linked, and it helps them to see themselves as being like part of a solution for that. So that can be very powerful, and it can influence the decisions of like what people are doing to get into like jobs and in the environmental field. So in Black Creek specifically, like this specific SNAP, the top of mind concerns for the neighborhood were food security and job security. So this SNAP really pushed for helping to find people jobs in the green sector. And for us, like the capacity building and skills training piece, like that was the biggest push to help get people into careers. So if you want to talk about what ways can a program like this be successful, I will give you 3 things. Number 1, we should really reclaim underutilized urban spaces and transform them into vibrant green spaces. We got to get creative with these privately owned public spaces like institutional properties, residential properties, partner with those landowners to create some, you know, naturalized community spaces, seating, shade structures, pollinator gardens, all those things. And don't just create them. When we're putting in this green infrastructure, provide programming and training in those spaces to build the capacity of the community, get them on board. We've had a number of our community members that have gone through our program and our trainings. They found employment in the neighborhood, in Downsview Park, Black Creek Community Farm, which is doing an awesome job. Even me here at TRCA. And so like we really have to provide that training so people can have a safe place to interact with nature and really feel like they're mastering that realm. Number 2, provide real incentives to reduce the barriers for people who are, you know, feel they're not able to participate. We have to provide things like transportation, facilitate childcare, provide, you know, food. Everyone, you know, loves a volunteer, but why can't it be a mix of paid and unpaid opportunities to ensure that certain groups are represented and are getting involved? Like, we got to recognize that certain groups don't have the luxury of free time. Like, time is not free for certain people. And I know it's hard to hear, but policy, our own policy, is sometimes a barrier to being able to bring, you know, those honorarium pieces and stuff. But there's got to be a way to honor and acknowledge people's time. Providing good incentives to participate will make our volunteer experiences really inclusionary instead of exclusionary. especially when the groups you're excluding are the low-income communities, racialized and marginalized groups. Don't just make it a volunteer opportunity, like really make it a job, right? Provide paid internships, right? Make sure that we do that social procurement, prioritize local hiring. You know, we partner in Black Creek with a lot of employment programs. We partner with JVS to get youth that have been in conflict with the law skills training in carpentry, so that they could help like build the outdoor furniture that we needed for our revitalized areas and in apartment towers. I'm thinking of the Investing in Neighborhoods program through Employment Services in Toronto. They open up 1-year paid contracts for people experiencing joblessness, and it gets them back into the workforce. So why not expose them to the environmental field at the same time? The third way I would say to build into a successful program and reduce barriers is to provide opportunities for people to access and have exposure to nature, but like in that multi-generational level. You know, parents can go with their kids or the grandkids, or aunties can bring the nieces and nephews, and everyone can learn together in an intergenerational way. Like studies have shown that when parents show interest in outdoor active living, their kids are more likely to participate in those activities. So we need to have that intergenerational mentorship. We've seen that to be true in SNAP. One success story that I'll end with here is a young lady. She had come up with her mom ever since she was in elementary school, and she told me that like she at first, you know, was just kind of grudgingly going with her mom, but after she was in the garden and the orchard and she realized that it was very therapeutic for her, she started to love it. And when the Green Champion program came to her tower, where she was able to learn how to take climate action in an apartment tower setting, like help educate her neighbors on like ways to conserve energy, water, and waste. And it opened her eyes. It brought climate action home for her in a really weird, like real way. And like along with the training she received in our garden, on site at her apartment tower where she was living, like, and having a supportive school environment, she's going to start university in the fall in a Bachelor of Economics with a concentration in natural resources and environment and economy. So she told me, she's like, you know, I know it was because I was able to have those spaces and really come alongside with programming that would introduce her to those topics. So I'm really proud of her. So go if you're listening.
Yeah. Well, Holly, thank you so much for your very in-depth answers, for those concrete actions that we know we can take, and also for the uplifting stories of hope that you shared. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So we're going to shift gears a tiny little bit and discuss kind of what the current state of diversity in environmental organizations is. So the findings we're sharing here are derived from a few academic studies that will be shared in the recommended resources at the end. So diving right into it, the percentage of females in leadership positions has increased over time, as has the percentage of ethnic minorities in the environmental workforce, though they are still dramatically underrepresented. And once hired, ethnic minorities are concentrated in the lower ranks, so few are ever in leadership positions, unless that position is something like diversity manager or similar. And volunteers for environmental causes are predominantly white, with volunteer opportunities offered largely in and around affluent suburbs. And we realize that this problem exists in the TRCA as well. And current recruitment strategies are a lot of the times through informal networks, which low-income and minority populations are less likely to be a part of. And Holly also mentioned this, that recruitment tends to favor volunteer or other unpaid work experience. And while these experiences have intrinsic value, they're also really only open to those with the financial freedom to work for free. And more, lastly, environmental organizations acknowledge the existence of systemic prejudices and they express a desire to diversify. But unlike the 3 recommendations that Holly gave at the end, few have committed resources or people to equity, diversity, and inclusion, and few present actionable items to work towards diversity and inclusion. So to continue with institutional barriers to inclusion, I'd like to invite our next speaker, Kayla Morales. So Kayla and I completed our master's degrees together, and she's currently an active member of the Canadian Young Hydrologic Society's executive team and sits on the Brampton Environmental Advisory Committee. Thanks so much for joining us, Kayla.
Hi, thank you for having me.
So first, why don't you tell us a bit about yourself and why you agreed to participate in this webinar?
Sure. Well, thank you very much for that introduction. I guess the only thing I'd want to add are that My parents actually immigrated from Trinidad and Tobago to Canada before I was born. So I grew up in Brampton, Ontario, which is a pretty diverse city. But growing up there, honestly, I identify so much with a lot of what Holly was talking about. So I'd like to thank her for her addition as well. I didn't have a lot of like outdoor experiences, and we'll get into like partially why that was growing up, but I love being outdoors. And the fun thing is when you love being somewhere and when you're very interested in something, you learn quite quickly. So you make up for it, that for sure. And yeah, I agreed to participate in this webinar again because diversity in the environmental sciences and academia is such an important topic. I've lived through it, or like for my short time, and I say short, I'm not well into my career as yet, but I'm here to really just have a conversation and simply share some of my own experiences.
Yeah, thanks so much. So getting right into it, I guess, what's the biggest or the most noticeable barrier in the environmental sciences in academia?
I would have to say it comes to like a lack of representation in terms of like who your teachers are. So when you're a student, and even like your own peers, you're looking around, there's not a lot of people who look like me or anyone who has a really person of color. You'll find people, but it's a noticeable difference. And root causes are like heavily connected to issues that have already been discussed, like an access to green space. And on top of all these factors, the fact that academia as a whole has historically been for people of a specific race, gender, and class doesn't help at all. This mindset, of course, is being changed now, but it wasn't long ago when the stereotype was that women went to post-secondary school to get their MRS and not their bachelor's, PhDs, or anything else. And most people of color were the minority in these schools. And if we're talking about environmental academia specifically, this lack of representation is grandfathered in and noticeably visible in the graduate levels, again, as like master's students, PhD students, and the professors who are teaching. This is all to say that as a person of color, when you enter the academic field, noticing that not one of your teachers, or maybe like one or two out of how many look like you, only solidifies the notion that the space was not entirely made with you in mind. You have to find a way to navigate that. And personally, I had to navigate that again with the addition of not having the same outdoor experiences as many of my peers because the outdoors or the environment were perceived as being far from the city when I was growing up. And when my parents grew up in a culture where people were trying to shift their lifestyles away from being in the boonies, so like being outdoors, they wanted their children to have experiences that they couldn't. So the thought was, why would you spend all of this money on like camping equipment or like even like a cabin when you can go to the beach, you can go to the CNE, you can go to the CN Tower, and why would you want to trade that for getting eaten alive by bugs and sleeping on the floor? Especially when they grew up camping, or not camping, but like being outside for free as children, because like where they grew up, like they're not going to go to the CNE, they're going to go to the CN Tower, they're washing the fence in their swimsuit and when it's raining, and they're having fun doing that. Like those are the stories that my parents tell me about having fun when they're younger. So when you can contradict, like when you compare like being outside for free and having to spend all this money, it doesn't make a lot of sense to them.
Mm-hmm. So it's like being outdoors in the sense of like camping or paying for outdoors experience is kind of like a frivolous expense, really.
Oh, exactly, yes.
Yeah. And it's also growing up in an immigrant household, environmental science is viewed as kind of a frivolous thing to study. I remember I was recently at the bank in an East Asian neighborhood, and the advisor asked me what I do. I told her I was a graduate student, and she was like, "Oh, your poor parents." Like I couldn't support myself and must therefore be a burden, and I had no job prospects. And none of those are true.
Oh yeah, no, exactly. When I had to like break it to my parents that like I switched from life sciences when I was in my undergrad to environmental sciences, and their first and honest question was, like, can you get a job in that? Like they were genuinely wondering. Like it didn't come from judgment, it didn't come from anything else but concern and curiosity. All they want is what I assume most parents want for their children, for me to be happy and like financially independent or stable. and to be able to take care of myself when they're not around. And it's a shared experience with many immigrant communities, talking to friends and stuff. I can tell the parents want the same, but the big focus is on job security. So parents often want their kids to go into skill sets they know are employable, which is why you find so many people pushing for their kids to go into like medicine or engineering or business. Those are normally the ones you hear people talking about.
But we do know that there are a lot of jobs in the green sector. So how can we change that mindset?
I am going to go back to representation and how we see green spaces, and like just even people having more experience in those green spaces. So people need to see other people who identify as like visible minorities in green spaces and in positions of powers like teachers, mentors, spokespersons even. Academia and other institutions can facilitate that by taking a good look at their policies and practices that might be contributing to systematic racism, which Holly did mention before. And honestly, some of these policies and practices are things that you don't realize are creating barriers, but they really are. And people can also dedicate resources towards inclusion.
I love that you said inclusion and not diversity, because tokenism, which is essentially diversity without inclusion, can be a big problem in academia and elsewhere. So we need to see that people actually have a seat at the table and can contribute actively, and they aren't just figureheads for diversity.
Oh, absolutely. And the funny thing is that people don't realize when they're contributing to these systematic barriers. I'm going to give a little bit of an example, but like, for instance, if someone in an informal conversation asks a colleague if they want to join a volunteer committee, and the person that they asked expresses some interest, and they follow up by saying, oh, good, because we're definitely lacking in the diversity front. That person's not going to think that they were recruited because they have anything to contribute to the table, or they know that they do, but like that their peers think that they can contribute because of the fact and that they were recruited because they are a part of a minority community.
Absolutely. I'd also add that visible minorities often have to put more work into their communication skills. So a lot of these initiatives that you're asking them to be a part of end up taking a lot more time than it would for someone else.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not great that like little things like that cause different barriers that more time than other people might have to deal with. But over time, you become numb to all the little like things that happen. There are a lot of little microaggressions that you let slide over time because the sheer number of them is just, you can't do anything but let it slide.
Yeah.
And if anyone's watching who is looking for ways of advancing inclusion in your organization, please just look at your policies and practices is all I have to say. People who look at them with people who have different experiences than you, because they will notice things that you won't notice. So for instance, I once talked to a head of a lab, and they told me that when they look into hiring prospective undergraduate interns, they look for someone that has backcountry camping experiences. Now, my first time going backcountry camping was literally 4 months before COVID, and I finished my master's right before that. If I was an undergrad trying to apply for this internship, I would not have gotten it simply because of that fact. It's a policy that's like harmless at first glance. It was well intentioned, I guess. We're in the environmental field at the undergraduate level. You can't expect lab experience. You can't expect fieldwork experience. So they decided to revert to backcountry camping in lieu of work experience. This practice marginalizes so many people when looking for undergraduate intern. And honestly, when you're looking for an undergraduate intern, in my own opinion, you should be looking for enthusiasm, willingness to learn, and maybe look at their grades, but I wouldn't put it any further than that. The undergraduates are like really there to see like what the lab environment's like, and most of their time is going to be like 95% of their time is going to be in a lab anyways. They're not going to be outside very often, so it doesn't like correlate very well. But like all of this just to say that little practices do make a difference.
Absolutely, so much so. Well, thank you, Kayla, for all your contributions. Reminder, if anyone has any questions for Kayla or other speakers today, please put them in the chat and we'll try to address them at the end.
Awesome, thanks.
So we would like to kind of close off today by talking about some existing initiatives in Toronto and across Canada that directly or indirectly address some of the barriers that we've discussed today. So for newcomers, TRCA offers a couple of options that you might want to be aware of soon. So any listeners, youth between 18 and 29 may be interested in the Newcomer Youth Green Economy Project. It's a 5-month part-time program that supports newcomer youth interested in environmental careers by providing access to field trips and experiential learning opportunities and job skills training generally. For young professionals who have been trained abroad, you may be interested in the Professional Access into Employment program. It's a bridge training that helps internationally trained environmental professionals gain an understanding of the local labor market and offers employment and job search coaching along with profession-specific and soft skills training. So a few others that are offered in the GTA. Holly already spoke about the SNAP program, so I won't go too much in depth about that, but we'd also like to draw your attention to Sundance Harvest, Growing in the Margins Initiative. Sorry. It's a 12-week free weekly educational program for low-income youth aged 18 to 25 who face barriers within the food system. It's intended for youth who would like to start their own urban farm or have a full-time career in urban agriculture or lead community food sovereignty movements, but they need hands-on farming experience to do so. So if you're interested in urban farming, but you don't fit the bill for Growing in the Margins, you can apply for their farm school, which is similar but not free and not targeted towards youth. TRCA also offers a handful of outdoor skills programs, such as Learn to Fish, Canoe, or Camp at various conservation areas. And we recognize that there are other eco-justice initiatives in the GTA that we haven't covered here. So please let us know about them in the feedback form you'll get at the end of this webinar, and we'll try to include those in our updated list of recommended resources. So here are some other Canadian programs that are not restricted to the Toronto area. And we've mentioned that connection to outdoor spaces in youth is a key driver for involvement in environmental and conservation causes and careers as an adult, but that doesn't mean that you can't connect to outdoor spaces as an adult as well. But there are real economic barriers to doing so for a lot of people, and these programs help to lower that barrier. So Park Bus basically gives you a ride from city centers to provincial parks and other hike and canoe launch points. A sub-program of Park Bus is NatureLink, which provides subsidized transportation to outdoor spaces and outdoor programming to newcomers. And recognizing the many systemic barriers that can make it challenging for newcomers to access the outdoors, NatureLink works to provide space for newcomers to explore new or familiar spaces and learn and build skills to build confidence in the outdoors and connect with other people in a fun environment. Learn to Camp and Learn to Fish programs are also available through Ontario Parks and Parks Canada. And there are a couple more programs we'd like to draw your attention to that are focused more specifically on environmental science. So I think these are especially important in the era of COVID, where for a lot of families, their exposure to environmental sciences has been reduced, with schools being shut. And the first is Soapbox Science. It's a public outreach platform to promote women scientists, and presenters stand on literal soapboxes in a public space, and they provide an opportunity for the general public to enjoy and learn from and heckle and question them and be inspired by their research. So for those with few science learning opportunities, this free forum is a really great way to learn. And for aspiring scientists, this forum is a great place to hone those critical science communication skills, which for marginalized people and for people of color, that's especially important to be working on. Another platform to get science to more people is Skype a Scientist. So scientists volunteer their time to video chat with students in their classrooms or even now families in their homes and have an open discussion with Q&A. So again, it's an amazing science communication opportunity for aspiring scientists, and many biologists, zoologists, ecologists, and physical scientists are available to talk to you on the platform. So this is a great way to ask them about their profession as well and build up your own network. And lastly, we'd like to really close today's webinar with some calls to action, because it's not enough to just know and educate ourselves. We also need to act. And please keep in mind that these are by no means exhaustive lists. There are a lot of things that we are not going to be discussing for the sake of time. So first, on the organizational front, what can we call on companies and institutions to do? So first, diversify images in marketing campaigns. So promotional signage and ads should send a message that green spaces are for everyone, they're inclusive and safe. We should also increase the number of paid internships and, like Holly was saying, create a pipeline that leads to full-time jobs and reduce the emphasis on volunteer experience. So volunteer and unpaid positions are common gateways to outdoor environmental careers, and they have intrinsic value, but they're cost prohibitive for many, and not everyone has the financial freedom to give away their time for free. Next, it's important that we create welcoming spaces. So some studies find that people who identify as Asian or African or Hispanic often feel uncomfortable when going to parks. And meanwhile, some white visitors reported discomfort when they're around non-white visitors. So there's a lot to unpack here, but there are some simple steps we can take to make outdoor spaces more inviting, such as maybe just updating park ranger uniforms to look less like law enforcement. And last and most importantly, we need to ask people to dedicate resources to educating employees on diversity and inclusion. So that's what we can ask others to do, but what can we as individuals do? You've made it to almost the end of this webinar, and have hopefully resolved to either look into some of the resources we've mentioned or simply to be an ally to marginalized and underrepresented people. Now, that's wonderful. So here are some small ways that you can get started. First, talk to your government representatives and ask them to commit to A, recognizing Indigenous history, maybe that's just by appropriate signage, and B, improving access to green spaces. Next, we need to celebrate diverse organizations and amplify their efforts. If you see initiatives that you think are really cool, let people know about them. It's as easy as retweeting or sharing and reposting on social media. And if you want to find more diverse voices to follow, definitely check out the site Diversify Outdoors. Next, educate yourself. So this is the big one, and you've already started by making it to this webinar. So there are a lot of ways to do this. For example, ask yourself, whose land are you on? And who are you not seeing represented in the spaces around you? Why is this the case, and how can you impact it? Lastly, take some time for self-reflection. What are some of the barriers that you face, and how might they be different for different groups of people? For starters, consider gender, race, social and economic limitations, and ability. How do you personally contribute to those barriers, and how can you personally contribute to removing them? So to help you unpack some of those questions, we put together a list of resources that will be shared with you all through a Google Doc. This way we can add and expand more resources to the list as it becomes available. And if you know of a resource that you would really like to share and you think is really important for everyone to know about, please be sure to email us or mention it in the feedback form. Lastly, I'd like to take a moment to thank our TRCA staff counterparts, Kate Goodell and Peggy Cheng. Thank you guys so much for helping us organize this whole webinar, and we're now happy to take questions.
So what advice would you give someone who would like to get into the environmental field?
Yeah, maybe I could jump in here. So considering I work in the environmental field, I think that people can get involved right in their local neighborhoods, right in where they live, talking to their property owners if they live in an apartment tower about, getting community gardens on site, about planting more pollinators, just getting real community action, civic action happening in your communities and in your neighborhoods in a relevant way, very specific to the unique needs of your own neighborhood, will help you when the volunteer experiences are not necessarily going to be there, right? So just get some action happening right in your own neighborhood. Look around. When we did our training, a woman, was telling us that before our training, she used to just walk by trees and not even realize they existed. And after our training, she would look at them differently and say, what are ways that I can help them? What are ways that I can, help them thrive? Just thinking about seeing all the suckers and stuff growing out and the way that they were being mulched incorrectly. And so there's some actions you can do. They created like that tree care training, tree care stewardship social enterprise. It was just community action where they were able to, now their names are registered with the local counselor. So if people call in to the local counselor's office saying, who would you recommend? Who can, come in my backyard and help me with some tasks? Those residents are actually, on file there for people to reach out to because they have the skill and the ability. So when volunteer stuff is not an option, maybe look to start a social enterprise, right? And do some environmental action in your neighborhoods.
Awesome. I'd like to jump in too with if you're thinking about like academia specifically, a great way to like really get involved if you don't have a lot of outdoor experience is to volunteer with labs, or it doesn't even have to be volunteer. A lot of labs do offer some paid internships for undergraduate students, and those are always great opportunities to go see fields and go see what scientists are doing in their field area. Also on top of that, if you're thinking about trying not to, if you don't have a lot of time to do stuff and you're really trying to get more experience in the environmental field, a lot of your courses or credits can actually be used by doing undergraduate theses. So you can always use that to do your coursework and also get more experience there as well.
Yeah, the only other thing I would add if folks want to get more involved is also just like do organizing work. Like that's how, outside of just like my personal interest in school, like that's how I really got kind of thrown into the environmentalism movement. I think it's really important though when you're getting involved to push your organizations or spaces to be intersectional. Otherwise, otherwise it's not going to be something that's sustainable for all futures. So yeah.
So this it connects with our next question. How would you go about systemic change in communities / schools with high concentration of POC?
I think what, in my experience, is really important to take in when we want to see systemic change is letting communities do that work and lead that work and be at the center of that work. I think there's in environmentalism and in a lot of different movement spaces, there's a tendency to do a lot of that like white saviorism where you're like, I want to come in, and a lot of times it's like well-meaning, but it's just further perpetuating that harm, because at the end of the day, you want these communities, usually like racialized communities, Black and Indigenous communities, to be self-empowered and be able to have the resources to connect to their youth and start empowering each other. So I would definitely, like, if you're a part of that community and you're feeling kind of like lost and you want to make these changes, it's more often than you would think. Like a lot of other folks want to do that as well, and it's just finding like resources and that collective power to come together is what I would suggest. But yeah, definitely doing that work in your own community.
Yeah, I guess I would say if you want to really, address like some systemic issues, you have to look at everything, look at everything. Don't have these silo programs, like as Yasmin was saying, that can be really unsustainable. Like, for the programs we're doing with SNAP or with the capacity building and training piece, we're addressing those like long-term maintenance issues of putting in some of those gardens, pollinator gardens or orchards and vegetable gardens and stuff, because people are receiving the training. Really invest in people's knowledge and invest in people's environmental literacy. Give them that education, even if they're not necessarily in an academic program to take it, like give it to them freely in their neighborhoods on those sites that we are greening. It's not worth it to just go and try to green spaces without that real good training and community engagement and bringing people on board to say what is going to be meaningful for you out of this, right? We want to increase the tree canopy in Black Creek. We want to plant trees, and people were like, we want to eat. We want to have access to fresh local food. And so we decided, okay, let's plant fruit trees. And so fruit trees became a really big push, and it was a way to like bring community interest and environmental issues and bring them together and really teach people that and help them see how those issues are interacting, but also really being able to listen to them and saying, okay, we're hearing you. This is an issue. This is what you want. This is where your passion or your interest lies. We're going to go with that. We're not just going to be like, no, I'm sorry, it has to be shade caliper trees, they're going to have the biggest environmental benefit, so that kind of thing. Just really hearing the community and merging interests with environmental issues, social issues and environmental issues.
I have to agree with Holly and Yasmin, like completely. When people feel like heard, they'll get involved and they will use those resources. If they're just like available, normally the word doesn't really get around. And I think that like being heard is a huge thing. When people feel that like their issues do matter and that they are being addressed, it helps a lot.
So I think that also answers one of the questions we got. How do we, as no longer youth, how can we empower young people to continue your great work? So if you have any other points, I think your answers did answer this question though.
I think youth are great in the environmental like activism. Like they're super on board with that, like a lot of stuff. I think that people are definitely getting involved. They're researching them with stuff themselves without being asked to. So I think there isn't a huge, I don't think there's a problem with getting people involved because their interest is there. I think it's just for us to create great avenues for people to like divert that interest into something direct and like, I don't know, like tangible. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's giving. Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Go.
Okay. I was just gonna agree with Kayla there. Like, I really don't think it's like people who are in the field already, who are in the careers, and how do they inspire young people? I would say, get inspired by some of those young people. Like, really, let's turn that around a little bit. Like, there's the youth in the environmental movement are miles ahead, I think, of what's already in establishment, right? So we have to stop and listen and hear and learn and understand from where that generation is coming from and the experience that those people are bringing, and honor that and acknowledge that and move on, just like Kayla was saying, in a tangible way. Like, we have to change our policies. Policies need to change, and unfortunately youth don't always hold the power to change policies. But if you want to know how to inspire young people to get into it, change some policies, give them more access and opportunities to participate, right?
Yeah, no, Holly spoke to that as well as Kayla, but yeah, just to echo that, just giving youth like the space to really fly and keep imagining, I think is what needs to happen, as well as just figuring out ways to have that intergenerational communication. I think there's a lot of harm that has been done between the generations, and we saw that with like the okay boomer like jokes, and like as much as that was funny, like that has hindered like intergenerational communication and like how we can interact with each other. So it's just about thinking about that like mutual respect, but also taking in the biases that we hold for both generations, and really thinking about the wisdom that both generations hold, or multiple generations hold. So yeah.
Yes, so important. Thank you to everyone that tuned in. We had a lot of great questions, but unfortunately we don't have time to get through to them all. And have a great evening. Thank you so much.